I think I'm set. And so today we're going to be using clickers. If you weren't here yesterday, how many people are new here in the room today from yesterday, did not use clickers? Okay. So if you're not familiar with clickers, I will show you what they are. My informal title is Using Clickers to Motivate Your Audience from Engagement to Adoption. And I'm going to talk in the first half today about clickers and how we can, some of the ways that they can be used effectively in training. And then I'm going to give you an example of a project that I'm doing with Dean Hertzfeld and Amy Meyer in Minnesota. And it also occurs to me that several elements of this show how well we cooperate with many other states, and we do this just as a matter of course. We use each other's expertise. But what are clickers? The real name of them is audience response systems. They can facilitate interactivity between the instructor and their audience, and you can use them in many ways. They're very well accepted by every audience that I've had. I've been using them for about 5 years now. There's a response device, which we typically call clickers, and there's a little receiver attached to your laptop here that collects the responses, and I can ask questions, as I will do. What's so special about them? Oops, I missed a little bit. All right, we're gonna just practice a little bit here with the clickers. For those of you who weren't here the other day, I will ask a series of questions, and you'll answer by pressing the number that corresponds to the multiple choice number up on the screen. This transceiver will collect the data, and I'll be able to show you what you said anonymously. So what is the most special thing about clickers? That they display the data on the screen, that the data can be saved, or both of the above. This is rather a nonsense question, but just something for you to practice on. So choose your answer. The polling is open. I only have 13 responses so far. What I'm looking for up here is I can follow as I train how many people in the room are actually following through. I don't think you can probably see the number of responses back there, but I can see it. It tells me right now 18 people have responded. If you've not pressed the button, you should do so for whichever response you want to do. If you press the clicker more than once with different numbers, it will only take your last one. So you can change your mind. But what some of my folks ask me is if they can sort of load the responses by pressing a whole bunch of number of times. It's only going to take one response per clicker. So I'll close the polling and we'll see what you said. Most of you said both of the above. I would say that's true. So showing the collective data on the screen is very powerful. Asking, typically for the audiences that we train, if I ask them for a show of hands in response to something, number one, people, if they respond at all, they put their hand up about this high. They're never going to hold it up this high. And in most of the audiences that I train, they are often there with people from their community. Sometimes they're in competition in business with these people in the community. There are other growers, or if I'm training commercial people, they're in competition with those other commercial applicators. They really don't want to raise their hand and show everybody else what they know or don't know. And so it can be very powerful because I can see what they're really thinking, what their real response is, without asking anybody to disclose what their own individual answer is. So I can get a lot better feedback. And it's also much more trustable to me if I ask them questions about, for instance, how often do you wear certain PPE? Well, if they think there's a regulator sitting in the back of the room, everybody's going to raise their hand because they know the right answer. But if they have a clicker, they're quite willing, I know this from experience from using them, to tell me what they really do. And then what's really important is I can use those data that show up on the screen to have a conversation with them maybe about why. Because once they see that 30% of the people in the room are using it the same way they do, which may not be the very best way, maybe they have good reasons, and this is where we can get to our motivators and barriers toward why they adopt practices or why they don't. Some of those barriers are things I can address with my educational outreach. Some of them I need to go back and design some research or talk with somebody else who can design a research project to look at better ways that we could address that particular barrier. And others may be barriers that we need to bring to the attention of the regulatory agencies like EPA and say, look, this isn't feasible. Here's what they told me. in a discussion after we showed it on the screen and they were willing to come out with it. So I'll show you ways that you can use all of those. It can also provide subtle peer pressure to do better when they see that others are doing it. But one of the reasons, I have also seen clickers used badly. If you are using them just to ask a series of questions, it's going to be uninteresting. You know, we all think my extension field faculty want to use the latest technology available, which is really great, but you have to know how to use it well, and you have to use it in an educational mode. So it's interactive in itself, but if all I do is take the data from you and move on, it's not very interesting, it's not helpful to me, it isn't helpful to them. So you have to use these to facilitate discussion, or else it's a very limited value. So some of the benefits of using them, we know from research results, which typically have been done in classroom situations. These things have been used in college classes and in K through 12. They improve learning by enhancing interaction, encourage deeper thought, improve the attitude towards subject material, and provide immediate feedback to the instructor so that I can move through quickly on some of the information that my audience is already familiar with. And I'm training different audiences every day. Not only because one day I might be training applicators who are ag-oriented, and the next day I might be training ones in right-of-way or aerial application or homeowners, but also, even if they're all ag, today's group might be different from tomorrow's group in what they know and what they focus on and what they don't know. So I have to, if I'm really good, this allows me to ask a few questions to figure out what I really need to concentrate on with this group today. And so it can be much better training, and that alone engages the audience better because you're talking about stuff that they really believe they need to know. The anonymity of these things is just a huge plus in adult education. As I said, you know, these people don't want to disclose what they do or don't know. So how can you use them? You can use them in preparing for certification exams. To me, that's kind of the least interesting way to use them, because there you're going for right and wrong, and you're just figuring out, do people know the right word? Do people know the right way, or do they not? And that's important, but we need to move past that. So they can really be helpful in teaching concepts in depth, getting into the audience members' reasoning. Again, I can't do it by the clicker questions alone, but if I construct my clicker questions very well and then ask some follow-up questions, and I'll say a bit more about that later on, I can get at some of that. I know I haven't done this, but I know that some of my colleagues, I think every pesticide safety educator from an extension program who's in the room here has used clickers, frequently uses clickers in part of their programming. And I know that Carrie Richards here from Pennsylvania sometimes forms teams. You can do that and have them sort of compete against each other. So that's a way to kind of make it more fun. But every group that I've used has found these they love having the clicker things. It's something that they really enjoy doing. I can also evaluate the results, and I'll talk about that when I get to the example of the project that Dean and I are doing. And you can also track results by sectors, so you can ask questions in the beginning on the demographics maybe, or who's an applicator in fruit and who out there is raising soybeans, so that you can track some of their answers. Maybe the soybean people are reacting differently with some of their handling practices that you would like to recommend. Maybe they're doing different practices than the fruit people are, and you can track that later. And again, you can go back and find out why. And Carrie, did you find the link still available to the training that we did earlier that was supported by NASDA Research Foundation?
I haven't been able to get a hold of Sharon, but I'm working.
Okay, so Carrie's trying to see if some of the results that we got before, because we did a whole session on this, and it was archived on the web, and you can, I think, get to it. I'm going through the really quick version today. So certification training questions, you can help people prepare, but then, can you see this slide? These people have had it with whatever their instructor was training them to do. Every one of them is sleeping on the desk here. That's a real slide. It wasn't set up, although this was not from a training session. This is a university, obviously. A typical university. But, you know, I have done training. When people are there for recertification, some of them really want to come. Some of my people come. I do a recertification class tomorrow, my biggest one, back in my state. Some of the people are there, they don't even need recertification credits, but they come because they feel it's important, they really want to learn the new stuff. Others are there just because they need their credits, and they may go to sleep. And there's not, I can't teach when they're asleep. It's very hard. So using clickers is really a way to keep them awake, keep them moving, and keep them interactive, if you do it right. So I'm not actually going to ask you, I think, in the interest of time, to actually put in the clicker questions. So I'm going to just go through these very quickly. I set these up in case you hadn't had practice, but I'd rather have discussion today than practice with clickers. I just want you to get the gist. So one of the things that those of us who use clickers is we've found that if you do it in blocks, small blocks, and ask a few questions at a time, that's way better than asking a whole bunch of questions at a time. You're just going to lose your audience if you ask a bunch of questions. How do you get more in-depth information after asking a clicker question? Would you call on somebody in the class to explain their answer, or would you ask for a volunteer to explain? Well, if you call on somebody, once again, you're going to put them on the spot. I have never liked to do that, and most of the time I get very grudging answers. However, oops, I guess I don't have that example with me. But what I usually do is say something like, well, that's really interesting. 20% of you answered X, and I didn't expect that. Would somebody be willing to share with me why? Because there's something I'm missing here that you probably have a good reason for, and I need to understand that. So you make it in terms of what I need to know as the instructor to do my job better. And they will, very often, somebody will come through and give you the answer. So adding humorous answer choices, does it help people learn because they pay more attention? Does it increase the likelihood of getting true answers? Is especially helpful if the audience is reticent? Well, my take on this is that humor, when you're using clicker questions, needs to be used very sparingly. And in fact, when you're teaching safety subjects at all, humor needs to be used sparingly. I noticed Stan did an example of what I often use of setting myself up yesterday when you said there are three dummies up here, the two in the corner and me. So I often will use humor in that way, but I don't ever want to use it to undercut the seriousness of the subject matter. And so my clicker questions, if I give them a funny choice, they're going to choose that funny answer. It's not going to help anybody. It's going to sidetrack things, and it's going to undercut what I'm trying to teach. Somebody in the training that Carrie and I did asked about learning enhancement questions and the jerk factor. In other words, there's always somebody in your audience who just wants to give you a hard time or subvert the training in some other way. So constructing good questions helps avoid the jerks. And no matter how many times I try to construct questions, and I don't have a set of questions. You have to construct questions each time you do something, do them new, but good construction helps you avoid that. When you get unexpected responses, take the opportunity for a teachable moment, not only to your audience, but again, as I said, to yourself. Is there something that I wasn't aware of? Or Carol Ramsey and I have laughed about this, one of my questions, because she borrowed a training set from me, and I told her, well, don't use this question the way it's set up here. We need to work on that, because I had asked the question, do you wear an apron when you're mixing and loading? Which we recommend. And like half of the audience said no. And I said, well, that's a really high number. And the second time that it happened with the second group of 100 people, I thought, these are not stupid people. They know something. There's something wrong here. And I asked, and they said, well, because we're already wearing our chemical resistant suit while we're mixing and loading. So of course you wouldn't wear an apron on top of that. So my construction of that question was very improper and very poor. Useful clicker questions, these are examples from real life of clicker questions that I've used and that I find really helpful. One is, does the signal word provide information about acute toxicity, chronic toxicity, or both? And this is something that if I'm talking about safety issues at all, I have to get this across to my audience. That label word does not provide any information about anything other than acute toxicity. So I have to get them past that. Do you ever use products that require chemical-resistant coveralls? Yes or no? Great. If they don't, I don't have to talk about that. And as we heard yesterday, Anubra Shah, Dr. Shah has done some recent research showing that only 5 out of the 1,800 commercial pesticide labels that she entered into a database, which should be almost the total available out there, had on the label that you need chemical-resistant wear on them. So, you know, often you won't have to address a certain subject. If they're in the audience and they do, then I need to know that. There are all kinds of other questions that, have you seen the PPE chart? That's been a helpful one to let me know whether they've used it. Here's an example of what's wrong with this construction. If I ask how often do you wear gloves when handling pesticides, can anybody tell me what's wrong with this construction? Anybody want to volunteer?
Is it just too general?
Well, it's general, but what if I really want to get at whether they do it, here's the improved construction. When the product label requires gloves, do you wear them? Because there are a whole lot of pesticide labels that don't require gloves. Now, we recommend that you wear gloves anyway, but they're not doing anything improper if they're not wearing gloves, if the label doesn't require it. So I don't want to, you know, my audience knows that, and they're going to get angry with me if I ask a question like that. And I'm going to lose credibility, and they're going to stop listening. So it's really important to construct your question very carefully to make sure that there's an answer choice that makes sense to everybody. So now I'm going to go through quickly an example of clicker-enhanced training that we are doing. We're really in the middle of testing this out. I'm doing this project with Dean Hersfeld at University of Minnesota Extension, and Amy Meyer at University of Minnesota is our statistical consultant on the project, our evaluation specialist. We worked really, really hard on the clicker questions that we set up. It's being funded by the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture Research Foundation, and also by the Minnesota Extension Pesticide Safety Education. And I also want to give credit to the Minnesota Department of Ag, even though they weren't able to fund it. They actually came up with the idea for this project, and I'm very grateful to them. It's based on a way that I've been teaching for a while, and I developed a set that Carol Ramsey and Carrie Foss from Washington State University and I have all used to train people. It uses results from the agricultural health study, research results from a very large epidemiological study. And it pairs them with our usual safety recommendations messages. And we wanted to see, we thought, Carol and Carrie and I thought that it was giving us feedback when we looked at the impacts of people who said they were going to adopt our recommended practices after we trained with this paired way of using it. It seemed like we were getting better results than with some of the other things that we try to use as motivators, or when we just do a class on here's the recommended procedures without a particular motivator. So Joe suggested we actually set up a research project to test this out. And in Minnesota, they have a series of training sessions that they do over 4 days to large numbers of applicators who we thought were largely similar applicators. So we wanted to pair the results from the Ag Health study with the traditional message. And we also used clickers. I need to tell you a little bit, and I'm going to give you very brief introduction to the Ag Health study here. Believe me, this is not how I would talk about it to an audience. I would give them an in-depth understanding of what it is and how they do it. But it's a long-term prospective cohort study where they're following 90,000 pesticide applicators and their spouses in Iowa and North Carolina over time. They're now about 11 years into the project, so they're beginning to get data back on this. They're looking at all kinds of agricultural exposures, not just pesticides. But pesticides are one, and they're trying to see if there are or are not specific associations, and possibly are there cause and effect associations between some of these exposures and some of the adverse health outcomes that they're looking at. So now, because it's been going on for 11 years, they're beginning to see long-term, be able to look at long-term chronic health outcomes, such as cancer and other long-term health. So the findings overall, the study participants are generally healthier, but there are some diseases that are more likely to occur with certain pesticides, certain methods of application, or other pesticide-related factors. And they also have some data that was interesting to me, and this was what made me first realize I could use it this way, because they have some data that shows they've looked at the practices of how people handle the pesticides as well, what level of PPE they generally use. They've collected this data a couple of times through this survey and gone back and asked the question again. So they have some data that also shows that people who used PPE more had a reduced risk in certain situations. So that tells me as an educator, I can reasonably demonstrate in a real world that there are potential health effects that occurred to some group, but that also the same group that was studied, if they were using their PPE properly, they had a reduced risk. That's powerful, I think, we think, because it tells you that not only is there a possible adverse risk, which is probably quite small, but in a large, you don't want to be the one who gets it, even if it is a small risk, but that there is actually something that you can do. So here were our study questions. Does pairing those research results improve the adoption of recommended safety practices, and how well, this is important because I don't think anybody else is doing this. We all struggle with this question. We want to know not only if we're changing attitude and knowledge. That's interesting to me, but not really compelling. I want to know that I've changed their behavior. So the best way that I can get at that cheaply is to ask at the end of my talk, and I've been doing this for years, please write down on a piece of paper, anything you're going to change as a result of this. And I go home and study it and come out with what they tell me they're going to change. With clickers, I can actually ask that question at the end of my session, ask questions in the beginning that ask them, what do you do now? Ask questions afterward, what do you think you'll do after hearing this? However, that tells me what they said when they left the session, right? So what we really want to know is how does that translate into the field situation? So Dean and Amy and I are tracking this through, this is the part that I'm really excited about. We're tracking this through a season. We're going to go back and survey a sample of these people who gave us permission to track their data, because these clickers can be used anonymously, but you can also track it if they give us permission, we can do that. So we're going to track that, and we will be able to see, all right, 90% said they were going to change this and upgrade the way they do this. How many of them really followed through during the season and did it? It is still self-reported data. We're not going to have anybody out there looking. But when you send somebody out there looking, that changes the behavior too. Yes, Dean?
I just want to add one piece. What we're doing, which makes this rather unique, is that each clicker has a unique identifier number. And we're actually tracking the individual responses.
Dean, you should come to the microphone.
Amy, this I think is, and maybe I'm jumping the gun, you're going to cover this, but these clickers have a unique number on the back, and we are actually tracking an individual's response. So we're doing demographics, we're seeing who that individual is down to a demographic level, sorting all the different people that are in the room, and then we're coming back in the fall and matching up an individual to their answers in the workshop later this fall with what the responses are to ask the question, did you change behavior? So we're tracking individuals, not a group response.
Right. And we asked the questions in a very structured way. So we're not just asking, did you improve or not improve? We're asking sort of what level they adopted. So we can track if we moved them up a little bit or if we moved them up a lot. We can look at whether some growers who were growing soybeans or whatever used the process more and all of that. And also, these data should allow other people to have an idea of how much you can trust the data when people walk out of the room and say, I'm going to do this. What's the likelihood? Then they may be able to also use our results to sort of estimate their success in a long-term basis on improving things. So we conducted these as a part of a series of recertification sessions this January. Very cold in Minnesota. I loved it. I had the greatest time with Dean and his group. I presented the data twice with the Ag Health Study data and twice without. So we had two populations who got the AHS data, 2 without. Then we had 6 pre-presentation questions loaded in there about their current uses to give us the baseline of what they currently do at the very beginning of my talk. Then I talked about the data. Or, with the group that didn't get the data, I just went into the straight safety recommendation stuff. And then we had the post-presentation questions, which were very much paired with the original questions that we asked. So here it is. With the AHS, we had an introduction, 2 slides, pre-presentation clicker questions, 6 slides. I talked about potential effects for 5 slides, exposure for 5 slides, potential consequences of AHS. There were 13 slides in that section. Risk minimization, 7 slides. That's the business where I talked about the safety practices that we recommend. And then post-presentation clicker questions, 6 slides. For those without AHS, they got a lot of the same information, but one of the things, instead of that AHS information in here, they got an unrelated presentation later to take up the same amount of time on residues in food that wouldn't impact what I had been trying to teach them ahead. So, yeah, and I have just 2 slides left, I think, so thank you. So both presentations, we just got the preliminary results just a week ago, and we really haven't time to digest them. Both presentations really appear to have been quite effective as measured by planned adoption of best practices. These are the kinds of things that we asked them: wearing protective gloves while applying, while adjusting equipment in the field, while mixing and loading, do you wear extra PPE? When do you shower or do you take a bath? And when do you do it? And do you wash your PPE separately from household laundry, your contaminated PPE? So we have a lot of work to do to digest that and look at it more closely. I can't really tell you anything right now. But one final question that I always ask, and this goes to the impact of the safety culture or safety climate discussion that we had yesterday. My final slide for most of the training that I do is a clicker slide that says, if tomorrow the Ag Health study says that they've found that a pesticide that you use has a clear cause and effect with a particular disease, what will you do? Will you switch to a different pesticide? Will you use more protective practices while using that pesticide, or will you do nothing differently? And I ask them to answer. And then I get the answers up there. They're usually half and half, number 1, half number 2. They're either going to switch to a pesticide that's different, or they're going to use different safety practices. And I say, well, my best answer is number 3, do nothing differently, because that means, in the case of you have already adopted all the safe practices with all of the chemicals that you use. Because if you only use your PPE when you perceive that you need to, you are going to be much less likely to be well protected. And again, the Ag Health study has documented, if I present it correctly, they have documented cases where the people who had the highest exposures, high pesticide exposure events, were more likely to be casual users of those safety practices. They used them sometimes and not other times. So I try to build this into always adopting that culture. And the final thing I will say is that NASDA Research Foundation is also supporting development of a series of PowerPoint slides with clicker questions in them on the Ag Health study, and pairing the messages from the Ag Health study very, very carefully. There will also be a leader's guide explaining how you can use epidemiological data like that, because you have to be very careful not to misstate risks when you are using epi data. So that'll be out, and at least the very first one in the series will be done by this coming training season, which will be this coming winter. And that's it. Thank you very much.